9 companies disrupted 1.4 million scam accounts in 1 week. No court order forced them to act. FBI, Secret Service, and Homeland Security handed targeting intelligence to Apple, Google, Meta, and 6 more. Each chose, on its own, to act. DOJ calls it first of its kind, a working model for cooperation against scam networks. But cutting off accounts isn't shutting down the network behind them. If your institution touches this infrastructure, that gap is already yours. Here's the number this whole operation was built to answer. The FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3, tracks reported losses from investment fraud across the country. In 2023, that number was $3.96 billion. By 2024, it was $5.8 billion. In 2025, according to IC3's own newly released annual report, it crossed $7.2 billion, a 24% jump in a single year. IC3 says plainly that figure is likely low. Many victims never file a report at all. Behind that curve are Southeast Asia-based operations running these schemes at industrial scale, not opportunists working alone, but organized networks, built to keep growing year over year. That's the problem Disruption Week was designed to interrupt. For a channel that spends its time inside institutional fraud and control failures, that number is worth sitting with. $7.2 billion isn't diffuse. It's concentrated in accounts, wallets, and platforms, the exact infrastructure your institution operates, monitors, or relies on every day. This isn't only a story about individual victims. These schemes run on infrastructure your institution may already touch: social media accounts, email systems, cloud hosting, payment rails, cryptocurrency exchanges. DOJ has said on the record that it wants U.S. businesses taking more proactive steps to protect users from scam operations. That's not a legal mandate. It's a public call from the agency that just coordinated a first-of-its-kind public-private disruption event. Think about what that actually means operationally. If a scam network can move funds through your payment rails, host content on your cloud, or run outreach through your messaging platform, then your terms of service enforcement isn't a side function anymore. It's a frontline control. DOJ's call to industry is really a call to whoever owns that control, whether or not they've been contacted directly. So how does a federal agency get 9 companies to act without a single subpoena? Investigators at the FBI, the Secret Service, and Homeland Security Investigations built specific targeting intelligence, real accounts, real infrastructure, tied directly to Southeast Asia-based scam operations. Then they handed that intelligence to the companies whose platforms were actually being used. From there, each company made its own decision, not under a court order, under its own terms of service, the same rules it already enforces against any other violation. Meta played a coordinating role, helping bring the rest of the group to the table. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. A subpoena creates a legal obligation. A voluntary action does not create the same compelled legal obligation. It creates a relationship. One company and one agency deciding, case by case, that cooperation is worth it. That can be faster. It's also less predictable, because it depends on the companies choosing to keep showing up. 9 companies. 5 countries' law enforcement. 1 coordinated week. Apple, Coinbase, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Silent Push, SpaceX, TRM Labs, ZenLayer, alongside law enforcement from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Thailand, and the UK. That's not a press release stretching a small pilot program into something bigger than it was. That's a real, named, cross-border coalition, the kind of list that doesn't assemble itself for a minor story. So what did 9 companies, acting voluntarily, actually produce in 1 week? More than 1.4 million social media and email accounts disrupted. malicious IP traffic and network connections interrupted. Servers, colocation environments, and hosting infrastructure tied to these networks decommissioned. $3.8 million in cryptocurrency voluntarily frozen. And 7 arrests in Thailand, with new cases opened by Thai police. That list reflects different organizations pulling different levers, not one shared switch flipped once. $3.8 million sounds like the headline number. It's actually the smallest figure in this story. The strike force runs a separate cryptocurrency seizure operation, a dedicated team whose cumulative enforcement total extends beyond this 1 week. As of the strike force's most recent public update, that team alone has restrained over $832 million in cryptocurrency tied to these schemes. It's worth being precise about what that figure actually represents. It's not a one-time seizure tied to this particular week. It's a running total, the accumulated result of an enforcement track that predates Disruption Week and continues after it. Treating it as this week's number would overstate what actually happened in these 7 days. Treating it as separate from this week's story would understate the scale of what the strike force is actually doing. 2 tracks, running in parallel. 1 voluntary and public-facing, Disruption Week. 1 direct and ongoing, the crypto seizure team. Don't mistake the size of 1 week's number for the size of the actual fight underneath it. Now the harder question. 1.4 million accounts disrupted, 7 arrests. DOJ's own release doesn't say who those 7 people actually were. Frontline callers, mid-level handlers, someone higher up the chain, it doesn't say. And it doesn't say whether any part of this operation reached the physical compounds these networks are actually run out of. That's not a gap I'm reading into the release. It's a gap the release itself leaves open. And it's the one question that actually determines whether this was a disruption or something closer to a dismantlement. This is exactly the kind of gap that gets smoothed over in a headline and left alone in the actual document. A number that big, 1.4 million, creates the impression of total victory. The 7 arrest figure, sitting right next to it in the same release, tells a narrower story. Both numbers are real. Neither one on its own tells you how much of the underlying network actually changed. DOJ says the relationships built this week are meant to enable future disruptions, not that this happens on a schedule, but that the door is now open for it to happen again. If it does, your institution has essentially 3 possible positions. A participant, handing over data, cutting off access when asked. A target, on the receiving end of that same kind of intelligence, or simply unaware, finding out from a headline instead of a phone call from federal investigators. It's a documented operating model DOJ says is intended to enable future disruptions. None of this requires your institution to have done anything wrong. It requires knowing where you sit on that spectrum before the call comes, not scrambling to figure it out in the middle of an active operation. When this operations coordination window was measured in days, DOJ's own materials describe these operations as running out of industrial-scale compounds in Cambodia, Laos, and along the Burmese border, many of them using trafficked workers who are frequently forced to conduct fraud. Whether losing 1.4 million accounts meaningfully constrains an operation built on infrastructure like that, or whether it's simply an absorbable cost of doing business, the documents don't say. That's the honest answer, even though it's not a satisfying one. A network built on physical compounds and coerced labor doesn't necessarily collapse because 1.4 million accounts were disrupted. That's a different kind of ending than most enforcement stories offer. There's no scene of agents kicking down a door. The release documents no compound closure. Just a documented interruption, a documented gap in what's known, and a documented intention to try it again. 9 companies chose to act on intelligence they had no legal obligation to act on. DOJ didn't call this an ending. It called it a relationship, built specifically so a disruption like this can happen again. The next time your institution gets a call like that, the real question isn't whether the government can force your hand. It's whether you'll already be at the table when it happens.